was quite struck, not only in the screenings, but in seeing patients that, you know, almost everyone has diabetes and hypertension. And, you know, when you look at some of the risk factors that you see in the United States of America compared with the Caribbean, it shouldn't happen. So that's what's called a disparity, because it's something that's not expected and should not be present. And so it's something we can do. So what I'm going to do in my portion of the talk is to just tell you what some of the work that I do in the United States and what affects people of color, because it's more disparities that you see there, and how we as Montserratians, or people in Montserrat, can transition ourselves to not end up in some of this in similar ways, because it's very preventable. So I want to start out by pointing out that cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the entire world and in the United States. As Dr. Scobie pointed out, it's becoming the leading cause of death also in the Caribbean. Generally, when you think of developing countries, right, you would think that the leading cause of death would be an infectious problem, right? In Africa, you think of things like malaria, tuberculosis, and other things like that. As the countries become more and more developed and continue to do better, instead of actually seeing that cardiovascular disease improves, you actually see, you know, an increase in cardiovascular disease. And why do you think that might be? Anyone? Okay, someone said McDonald's. So that's an extreme example, but we don't have McDonald's on the island. So why are we seeing, you know, this increase in hypertension and diabetes? So when you really, and you can keep going with this slide, so when you look at 100,000 lives each year, that's equivalent to a jetliner crashing every 3 minutes, okay? The amount of lives that's lost by cardiovascular disease. So it's quite a compelling issue. Now, you can go to the next slide. In the United States, when we do outreach, we try to go to communities of highest need. And the reason is that there's a difference in life expectancy depending on who you are in the United States. And I left the Hispanics out because, you know, we're talking about comparing in general people of the African diaspora and our the Caucasian counterparts. So the life expectancy in the United States of a white female is about 80. The white male and black females have a similar life expectancy, which is about somewhere close to 74. And the black male, and this is not really projecting well, but and the black male has the lowest life expectancy, somewhere around 66. Next slide. In Montserrat, okay, and I wanted to take a look at this, and we don't have data going forward from 2004. But I wanted to point this out because even though the life expectancy of the male and female now appears equivalent to that of the white male and white female in the United States of America, and this is great, but remember this is in 2003, 2004. If you look at 2002, what do you notice? The life expectancy was higher, right? Okay, now this is a trend. It's a trend downwards. It's something we have to watch, okay? What's going on? I'm not sure, but to tell you the truth, with the amount of diabetes and hypertension that I'm seeing, it's something to be of concern. So hopefully, Dr. Owens, I see you sitting over there in the back. I'll be working with you and we'll continue to look at these life expectancies because for 2005 and 2006, you continue to see the trend down, then I think that is very alarming and we need to really step up the ante and do more in terms of prevention. Next slide, please. We talked about reasons for differences in life expectancy in a big country would be what we call disparities. So it could be differences in income, in insurances, in where you live, etc. But here on the island, it's a pretty cohesive group. Everybody more or less can live equally or do what they want. So it shouldn't be the same reasons that we would expect to see an increase in hypertension. So I think on the island, it probably has to do more with our lifestyles. Next. Okay, and I just wanted to point out that when you talk about cardiovascular disease, as the leading cause of death. Hypertension is the single biggest contributor, and it could be prevented. And the other point that Dr. Scobie mentioned is generally hypertension and diabetes go hand in hand, right? Because the diabetes we're talking about is not juvenile onset diabetes, it's adult onset diabetes. And those two go hand in hand because of generally physical inactivity and obesity. And the other point I wanted to mention about diabetes is what we call a risk equivalent, so that when you have it, it's akin to having had an MI, a heart attack in the past, in terms of your risk of continuing to get heart disease. So you really need to get it controlled. So she spoke about diabetes. I'm now going to really spend a little time and talk more specifically about hypertension. When you look at data and compare people of the African diaspora, starting from the mainland and going to the United States, what you expect to see is that people in the United States should, based on their living and McDonald's and other things, they would tend to have hypertension at a higher rate, higher prevalence than in the Caribbean, which is then higher than in Africa. And this is data coming from one of our colleagues who presented this about 4 or 5 years ago, comparing West Africa and the Caribbean using Barbados and Jamaica and then the United States. Next slide. Skip ahead one slide. Okay, so when you look at that paper and you look at the data we got in Montserrat, it's the opposite, right? Because if you look at New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco, and I know a lot of you have traveled to these places. These are large urban, right, centers where you see a lot of people of color. And when we look at this in the United States, these are the people who have the highest rates of blood pressure and diabetes compared with everyone else. We shouldn't expect to see that in Montserrat you're having higher incidence here of blood pressure and diabetes in the screening. Again, we only screened 200 people last year, and hopefully as we spread the word and things get better, I hope to see that this prevalence goes down. But we're continuing to check, we're continuing to spread the news, and I hope to see that those numbers go down, back down to the 26% that was studied a couple of years ago in that paper. And I don't know if there's something very specific about Montserrat that's causing that, but again, it needs us to wake up and start paying attention to our lifestyles. Go back one slide, please. So when you talk about hypertension, if you're a person of color, at least in the United States, when you have hypertension, you have a worse outcome compared with whites. And so you'd have, the hypertension happens earlier in life, you're more likely to have stroke, both fatal and non-fatal, and you're more likely to have heart disease resulting in death, and kidney disease. How many people here know someone who's on dialysis? Okay, next slide, and next slide. Okay, so these again are some of the factors we talked about, and I think the ones that we're more focusing on here in Montserrat is limited exercise, maybe stress, okay, the diet. We talked about fruit, and I'm not a nutritionist, but if you're gonna eat a whole bucket of mangoes, you're gonna have, high blood sugar. So you gotta look at salt, and a lot of people I've met today have told me they're not using salt, but salt comes in a lot of different foods, right? In prepared foods, in cheeses, crackers. So even if you're not sprinkling the salt on, you gotta be very careful about salt intake, because salt is one of the biggest contributors to hypertension. Obesity, of course, people are now driving everywhere, they're not walking. We have these wonderful hills here, we could be walking and losing weight. And there are other things such as white coat hypertension. Does anybody know what white coat hypertension is, a white coat effect? I actually had one patient today. It's when you go to the doctor and your blood pressure is high at the doctor, and when you go home, it's normal. But you can measure your blood pressure at home, and we're gonna have an opportunity to give you some blood pressure cuffs today that you can measure your own blood pressure at home. But that's important because white coat effect, even though it's high at the doctor's and not at home, it means that under situations of stress, your blood pressure goes up. Because people say they go to the doctor, they get nervous, they get worried, and their blood pressure goes up. It's something to keep in mind, because it means that in situations of stress, your blood pressure goes up. Next slide, please. Okay, just go to the next slide. This slide, the prior slide, had to do with, again, trying to preserved meats. And I know that one of the things that, I don't know if it's happening a lot on the island, but I know my great-grandmother used to preserve meat with salt. Does that still happen? Okay, sometimes, you know, the dried meats. And then we like, how many people here like saltfish or bacalao? All right, we eat it in various ways. So that also has salt. So some of the foods we prepare have salt in it. And that slide was just to show that their foods can be prepared with salt, and just to be cognizant of that. Now, looking at physical inactivity, this was work done by one of my colleagues, Dr. Laura Mosca, in 2007, that looked at physical inactivity and compared females. And Black and Hispanic females are more likely to be physically inactive. Next slide. And more likely to be overweight. In fact, this slide shows obese and overweight women age 20 or older, and it's pretty high. Overweight is defined by your height and your weight. So, you know, that's your BMI, and I think we've been checking that, right, Janice and John? So, you know, again, it depends on your height, but when you look at the height and the weight, Black females and Hispanic females tend to be more obese compared with white females. Next slide. So I also am very interested, as again, in stress, because everyone has stress, and it's how you manage your stress. And stress plays a big, big role in heart disease. It's not typically what you think of, but I ask you all to please have some me time, some time that makes you de-stress, to take a few minutes per day and look at yourself and find out whether you're stressing too much, because stress will make your blood pressure go up. And if you don't believe me, ask some of my patients who came to the clinic today. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so how do you make healthy lifestyle changes? You relax and deal with stress. You increase your physical activity. Alcohol, it can be good for you in very, very tiny amounts. If you drink too much, it will make your blood pressure go up. And you work with your family and friends. Next slide. This I put up so that you should know your numbers. How many people in here actually know what a good blood pressure should be? Show me by raising your hands. So what should be a good blood pressure? Okay. How many people know what their blood sugar is? Okay. How many people know what their BMI is? Again, your height to your weight. Anyway, the point I'm making is, if you want this slide, I'll be happy to provide that for you. We may have it, but you need to know what are the good numbers and what are the bad numbers. This should be your Bible. Know what your blood pressure should be, 120/80. Know what your cholesterol should be. Know that there are several parts of the cholesterol, and they all go hand in hand. Know what your blood sugar should be, and know what your BMI should be. If you know these numbers and you live healthier, then you'll live longer. Next slide. Okay, so this is going to segue into our next section, and this is a happy story. Okay, so again, remember I said I had a slide there that says work with friends, family, and organizations and others to help you to be a better and healthier you. I had an opportunity to attend a fashion show. This was in February in the United States. There's a month that's called Heart Month or Go Red Month, and it's a month that reminds you about heart disease, and many organizations and many people get involved. And some of you may recognize some of the stars here, but you have up there like Heidi Klum and Joan Collins and Kimora Lee Simmons and Fantasia and all kinds of people. But the point is, they're out there spreading the news and increasing awareness about heart disease and how they themselves or a member of their family conquered and improved themselves with heart disease. And so I have a very special guest who is our star and our model, and she was a patient who we spoke with last year. Is she here? Oh, okay. Well, I was just told she's not here, but this particular young lady, when she comes in, we will showcase her because we met her last year, and in simply increasing the amount that she walks, watching her portions, you know, how much she eats, cutting back on what she eats, she lost over 46 pounds. And she went from a size 22 down to a 14, and she continues to do so. And so we invited her to be here to share her story, and she was going to be showing us, you know, what her clothes size went from to where she is now. And her name is Delmar.